Okay, so it's part 3 of lesson 12, and our mean stack application is coming along. We can add and we can view. We want to add delete functionality, which would be fairly simple, and then we'll want to add edit functionality, which would be a little more advanced, because first we'll have to select a food, populate the form, and then process the update. But we'll start with delete. And get my Express server back up and running. I had pushed my code to Git. So in my food component, I'm going to add maybe an empty th at the end. And for starters, we'll just put in delete buttons. Say delete, so it'll look like this. So we'll get delete buttons, and we'll add click handler that will delete the food. It'll pass in the ID parameter. Now, this is showing up in red because we don't have a delete food method in my component. So I can create it manually, or I could actually use my code hint to generate it, and it creates a delete food method for me, which is kind of nice. So we'll pass in and we can even add our confirmation here. In this case, we'll then call this dot food service. We haven't written this method yet. We'll call it delete food. We'll pass in the ID. And again, we'll subscribe to the response. And our response after we deleting is really going to be the same as our response here. We're going to want to refresh the list. We'll call our get method. No Angular's complaining. I don't have a delete food method in the service. But hey, do we want to create one? Sure we do. So I'll let WebStorm create the delete food method form signature here. And we'll return, in this case, we're going to use the HTTP delete method. Our URL is going to be a little different. So we're going to need to append on the ID as a parameter, plus underscore ID. And then we'll also need our headers, like we did when we were adding, because we are passing information in. We don't need the header for get because there's no values being passed to the API. However, with add and delete, we're passing in values, so we're setting up that content type header as application JSON. So here's our component. We give a JavaScript confirm. If it returns true, we call our service and we pass in the ID. We wait for a response and then we refresh the list. In our service, we take in the ID. Now, actually, this is defined as, we could probably define it as a string. Sorry, no, we don't even really need to define it. Let's do it here. Could define it as a string, we don't have to. So now we need a router.delete in our Node API. So this is delete. So there will be an ID parameter. So we haven't used this in Express before. We've only used get and post. And we've now got an ID parameter. So we're going to use mongoose. We're going to call food remove. We pass in the ID as our request.params.id. So the value that gets appended in after the slash. We'll get back an error. Or it may return back a food item. If we have an error, we'll do the same things we've been doing. We'll log it out. And we'll return a JSON response. If we couldn't add, whoops, I left out my fat arrow here. Otherwise, we'll return a JSON response, status of 204. I believe is accepted. We can go check that in our HTTP status code list. And no content, actually. So here's our method in the server API. We'll take in an ID parameter. We'll use mongoose to try and remove that document. We'll send a JSON error response if there is. And if there isn't, we'll send a 204. There's no content. Success. Our service will take in the ID and call the API. So the URL is appended on. Don't forget the slash here. And we're including our content type header, application JSON. And our component is going to pop up a JavaScript window. If the user clicks OK, it's going to call the service. And in our HTML page, our delete button calls delete food and passes in the ID, excuse me, of the current food. So let's give this a try. So now if I want to delete something, first I should get my confirmation when I click the delete button. If I cancel, nothing happens. If I say OK, basically just disappears. So even though there's a lot of code, it seems to happen quite quickly. My form calls the component calls the service, service calls the API, which removes it, and then the component refreshes the page. So lastly, we want to add the ability to edit. So if I click edit, I want to populate the form. And when I click save, I want to call an update back and then a refresh of the list. So let's do that as well. So we're going to actually need two methods to do an update. We're going to need one method that selects the food and populates the form, and the second method that will actually process the update. So we're going to write two methods in our component. First one is going to be called SelectFood. And we are going to pass in food object. So this will be display selected food in the form or editing. So in this case, we want to populate both the name and the country in our form. So here's how this will work. If we add edit buttons here, when we click, we're going to call select food, but instead of just passing in the ID, we're going to pass in the entire food object. And what our component will do is take the name and bind it to the name property and take the country and bind it to the country property. And because Angular ng model is two-way data binding, that will automatically display the name and country in our form inputs. So let's go ahead and add that button. We'll add a click handler. So we'll pass in, rather than just one property, we're going to pass in the whole object. Should be all we need to do for the form. So this button triggers this method. This method populates from the incoming food object the name and country, and the ng model will automatically populate the form values. So now, as soon as we choose something, our form populates. Now, if I save, it's just going to add a new food. We don't have any code set up yet for updating. So we're going to need to write three methods. We're going to need a put method in our API. We'll need an update food method in the Angular service. And we'll need an update food method in the component that calls the service. So we'll start in the back end with our put method. It's also going to take a parameter. We're going to use put, which is typically used for doing updates. Our usual request, response, and next parameters. So we're going to use Mongoose to update. So we're going to do an update for select the document with this ID. Our code's going to look a little bit different. So we're going to call set. The name is going to come from the request.body.name. Country from the request.body.country. Okay, so we're going to update the name and country from the request body for the selected document. And then we'll see if we get back an error or a food, and there is a null parameter here first when we're doing this. Now, if we've got an error, we'll log it and return it as JSON. And I'll use 501. Otherwise, you can send a 200 response, an OK. Or actually, we'll send a 202, an accepted response. So we're accepting an update. So we're using put. With this ID, we're identifying the document. So this is like our where clause. So using the ID from the URL parameter, we're trying to update by setting the name from the request body and the country from the request body. And then we're evaluating if our update worked. So there's our first put, there's our first update method. We now need to jump over to our service. In this case, we want the whole object, not just the ID, because we need the new name and new country. We're going to call put. Again, just like with delete, we're going to append on. In this case, we'll have to get it from the food object. Delete only needs the ID, but update, we need the full object. And again, we'll need to specify our content type as JSON. So our add takes a JSON object, our delete takes an ID, our update will also take a whole JSON object, but our parameter is going to need to use the ID. So there's our service. We'll need to write our update method in our component. And then we're also going to have to modify our UI a little bit to make sure that method gets called. So now in my component, we want to update the selected food from the form values. Call update food. Create this method, so we'll say let food equal should be this name. We're going to fill from the form and country, also from form values. We're going to create a food object from the form values. Call the service to update. We'll pass in our food object, and again, subscribe. We'll wait for a response. When we get a response, we want to, again, update our list and clear out the form. We'll call our get method and our clear method. So there's our update method in the component. Create a new food object, pass it to our service, which also has an update food method. Now we're going to need to do a little bit of work here because the save button we have right now calls add. So we also don't have a place for the ID. So we're going to add a couple of elements to the form to get this to work. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to add a second save button, but we'll show one and hide the other one. So this one, when we click it, this will call update. Now, if we look right now, we're going to see two save buttons. So we're going to write some code that will show one and hide the other. So what I'm going to do, so we know which one to show and which one to hide, I'm going to add an input called ID, _ID. I'll make it type as hidden. And the ng model will be our ID. So when we're editing, we'll have an ID. When we're adding, we won't. So on my button, on the add button, we'll add a star ng if there's no ID, show the add button. And on our update, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to do ng if equals _ID. So when we have no ID, the first button shows that calls add. When we have an ID, the second button will show that calls edit. So let's look at how this works. So my update button isn't showing right now. You'll notice if I inspect, right? This is my so we can see here's our ID input, but there's no value. When I select, we now get the other button. Actually, the way we could maybe check it, maybe just so that we can see. We just change those to say add and update. We can see how the buttons toggle. So it says add as soon as I select a food. Let's see. So here's our ng model. is the ID. I think in my component, when we select the food, we also need to say this.id. We need to populate the ID when the user clicks on a food. We should see this now. So when our page loads, the add button will show. As soon as we click, it says update. So now I want to try to modify one of the food items. So let's change this to okay, didn't quite work. Our form cleared out, but notice my values got wiped out. So this didn't quite work. Let's figure out why. I think, let's see. So in our component, okay, so something's missing. We're almost done, but let's have a quick look at why. So our update button is calling update food. So our update food, we are taking the ID, name and country, and then we're passing it to our service. Service is taking this in. We never passed in the request body. Notice in the add, we actually passed in the JSON object. Here's our URL and our header, but we need to include the actual request body with our new values. It should fix our problem. So we'll try this again. We'll let it reload. So now I'll try and update this one back to pizza. So now my update is done. Now notice my update button is still showing. That's because we still have the ID up here. So in my clear form in the component, we also need to set the ID to null. The ID being null, we'll toggle our update button back to add. So now if I want to edit, once I'm done, this button should change back to say add, which it does, and my edit runs. Now also, if I click here and I don't want to do an update, if I just want to reset things, I should just add a reset button that will clear the form. So I could add that as well. So maybe up here we'll add one more button. We can put beside. An angular click, it can just call clear form. So this way, if we select something, we decide we don't want to edit it, we can wipe the form out without saving changes. So now, if I don't want to make any changes, I can just hit reset. Now I realize we didn't add a drop down in here. It's going to add a lot of code for doing this. So I think I'm going to leave my application as it is. So at least now we can create, read, update, and delete. We can do this all in a single page. We don't need to reload. You can see how using the Angular component service and the two-way data binding make this possible. I will push all my code up to Git. And if you have questions, then feel free to email me or we can meet through WebEx.